Hello whisky fans, a very late happy St George's Day to my English whisky fans, and a hello to fans of English whisky from all over the world, because English whisky is really going places these days. So last week I had a look at the newish release from the English Whisky Distillery in Rydham, Norfolk, which was the English Sherry Butts. I think that was about 8 years old, 46%, really good stuff. And when I was doing the video for that, I brought out another couple of very old bottlings from the same distillery in Norfolk, and I didn't think of it at the time, but in hindsight, one of them in particular, I really should open and sort of compare it to this new release, because this here, I think this is one that I dug out last week, is the English Whisky Company Chapter 10, and the reason I want to look at this one is that it's matured in Oloroso sherry casks. It's a vatting of 2 casks, distilled in October 2010, bottled in September 2015. So same ABV, same distillery. We don't know that this is from an Oloroso sherry butt, but possibly is, probably is. This one we know that it's from a sherry cask, don't necessarily know that it's a butt, but they should be very similar whiskies from the same distillery. The only real difference is that this one here, the very old bottling that's been on my shelf since 2015, is a very curious 4 years old and 11 months. So why they didn't give it those extra few weeks to be able to call this a 5-year-old whiskey, I'm guessing they just didn't care. They thought it was ready. They wanted to release something and this was picked, because the English whisky back then, and I think they still do it on most of their releases now, they tend to give you a fill date and a bottle date, so you can work out the age, but it's quite often not explicitly stated. But this whisky here, being very nearly 5 years old, and this whisky being 8 years old, they should be a nice little snapshot in time of how the kind of whisky that English distillery was making, with a kind of apples to apples comparison. So it'll be interesting to see what's changed, if anything, over that sort of double maturation period. So the other details on this bottle of the English Whisky Company Chapter 10, it states natural colour and non-chill filtered, whereas the new release doesn't, so really disappointed about that. I suspect that they'll probably say, if you ask them, that it is, but it's really sad that they've decided not to give us that information and that promise that they'll never change that on every bottle. I think that's a really big deal. This is 46%, and it's actually very limited run, because this Chapter 10, at least this one that I had here, was one of a limited edition of 650 bottles. As I mentioned before, that is a vatting of 2 casks, and we know that they are casks number 816 and 817. So very small batch. One thing that I do want to point out and show you with this one is, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but this whiskey it's a little bit lighter than the new release, which you'd probably expect, but it's very hazy. It's what I would call cloudy, and I don't remember off the top of my head if that was the case when I bought it, or if it's some of the minerals coming out of the water and causing that haziness. But that level of haze, I really hope you can see that. It's just very conclusive proof that this is a proper craft presentation, very lightly filtered, and definitely not chill filtered to have that level of haze and minerals left in the bottle. I did actually do a video a really long time ago. It's one of the Whiskey Stuff series. It's one of the first videos I did about haze and about getting bits of cork in bottles and stuff, bad corks, TCA and all that sort of stuff. And if you have a look at that video, there's actually some photos I took of some of the crystals floating in a bottle of, I think it's 16-year-old bourbon cask matured Bruichladdich. And you can see exactly the same sort of thing in this. I'm not going to be able to show you that on camera, I don't think. Or maybe, if you look in the bottom there, just on the floor of the bottle, you can see there's some little fine crystals. And that is calcium oxalate, just minerals separating out of the water that's gone into this whiskey. Completely harmless, and it's a sign of a quality product. One other thing that you might notice about this whiskey, that is not an English Whisky Company cork. Some of you may recognise that style of cork stopper, because the cork that I took out of this, I had this on my shelf since 2015, only actually opened it after I'd done the review for this one, because I thought it's just too good an opportunity to pass up to review these two side by side. But the cork that actually came in this bottle is this one here, and it doesn't look too bad, but when I took it out, quite a lot of bits of it were falling off, and if you squeeze that cork, it's like a sponge. So that's not an effective cork. So that is exactly why I and everyone should always keep a stock of old corks of various different sizes in your kitchen drawer or wherever. They can dry out eventually, but if you see a bottle of whiskey that you take the cork out and it's a decent cork, like this Highland Park one, it definitely pays to keep those on hand, just so you can replace the corks and keep any bottles that do have any problems intact. I will also mention that there have been a couple of these very old, sort of 8-year-old now, these bottles. I mean, they were bottled 8 years ago, that were sherry matured. There was this one, the Chapter 10, which was Oloroso sherry, and there was a Chapter 12, which was matured in Pedro Jimenez PX casks. And in my opinion, as is almost always the case, the Oloroso cask made the more interesting and complex whiskey. So let's get some in the glass and see what we've got. And importantly, see how it compares to the new 8-year-old version at twice the age. I think, I'd have to look at my notes to be sure, but I think I paid around £45-50 for this, something like that. So pretty typical price for a decent craft presentation release from a new distillery, and it's a bit cheaper than what I paid for this one. This retails for about £60-65, so the price has gone up a little bit, but then it's a much older whiskey. So English Whisky Company Chapter 10 on the nose, using my Tomatin glass today. Tomatin's a distillery that I really need to revisit at some point soon. So kind of, as you might expect for probably any whiskey which is only 3 or 4 years old, slightly rough on the nose, but you can definitely tell that there's been some really good quality sherry casks in this one, and in this case it's just 2 sherry casks because they've got the cask numbers on the label. Getting some really nice dry sherry notes on the nose, a nice nuttiness, a nice almond marzipan note coming through from those sherry casks. Also getting some rather surprising rum and raisin ice cream notes, so some lovely vanilla fruitiness, raisins, nice oranginess, which is another very stereotypical Oloroso sherry note, orangey maltiness, very perfumed, quite floral, a little bit of a Turkish delight and elderflower note on the nose. Let's see how it tastes. On the palate, quite I think the defining phrase for this one would be fruit and nut. Kind of like Cadbury's fruit and nut chocolate, but without so much of the chocolate. It's also got that rather dry mineral note that you get in a lot of English whiskey, and I think that's partially accentuated by the young age of this one as well. As per the nose, you can tell that this is a young whiskey, although I think that the youth presents much less on the palate than it does on the nose. It's quite a rubbery note on the palate of this one. It's the kind of rubberiness that I'd normally associate with a wine cask, a wine finish, perhaps. And if you actually look at the tasting notes that they've got on the label of this one, it does say somewhere, they actually say on the nose, I'm getting it on the palate, but they're describing it as wine gums. And I almost never pay any attention at all to the tasting notes that you get on bottles, because I think that more often than not, they're done by people who seem not to really have a good idea of what they're talking about. I do suspect that they're often done more by the sales department rather than the people that make the whiskey, but wine gums, definitely something of that in there. And again, the palate, more floral notes, a little bit of bitter caramel, and some nice orangey maltiness. One more sip. As for the finish, medium to medium long in length, lots of dry maltiness, quite a nuttiness coming through from that sherry cask, and there is, as always, a little bit of youth showing. Something that does surprise me is on the finish of this one, there is a little bit of a nutty peanut bourbon style note on the finish. That sort of nutty peanut note is something that I kind of associate with bourbon casks. So it does make me wonder if some of these casks might have been seasoned with Oloroso sherry. They might be bourbon casks that have been seasoned with sherry, but I could be completely wrong there. It could just be a little bit of nuttiness coming through from those sherry casks presenting as something like a bourbon cask. My main criticism of this whisky, if anything at all really, is that there is that little bit of youth, which is kind of to be expected, is that it is slightly rougher on the nose and slightly thinner on the palate, especially when you compare it to the new 8-year-old Sherry Butts release. But you kind of expect that. I would say that if anyone sees any of these bottles dusty, looking sorry for themselves in a shop where they've been there for a long time, providing your cork is intact, I'd say that if these are at a good price, maybe £40-45, they're well worth picking up for any fans of English whisky that want to experience a little bit of English whisky history. As for a grade, I'm going to give this one a very respectable B-. I actually think that it's surprisingly close to the very, very good 8-year-old release that the English Whisky Distillery have just brought out. I actually think that it's surprisingly close, much closer than I expected it to be, between this 4-year-old English whisky in the sherry cask, very close to this incredibly good 8-year-old sherry butt release from English Whisky. I thought there's going to be an entire world of difference between these two, and you can definitely tell there is a difference. The new whisky is better, it's more mature, it's got more character, a little bit more complex, and it's just rounded off all those edges, but much, much closer than I expected it to be. And I think that it's really interesting to get this little 4-year time capsule snapshot in time between these two expressions. And I really hope that this is the sort of level of improvement that we're going to get from other English whisky distilleries as they get into their second decade of operation. So let me know what you thought of this video in the comments, what you think of English whisky. Do you think that English whisky is improving? Or do you think that some of them are resting on their laurels and pumping out the same old or same young stuff? And what distilleries, English or otherwise, are you looking forward to trying when they start to get some higher age statements? Thank you for watching, and cheers.